Okay, here we are, kinesiology 231. This is video number 2 regarding flexibility, and this will kind of deviate a little bit from chapter 12 in our book, and it's going to be just a quick conversation regarding fascia because I do believe it has its place in terms of what we do with clients as well as athletes. When you look at the human body and when you look at the idea of fascia and the interconnectedness within the body itself, we have muscles, tendons, ligaments, bones. All of this is held together by two main forces, tension and compression. Compression being provided primarily through gravity, wanting to pull our bodies down towards the floor, and then tension, which is provided by the muscles, tendons, and ligaments that all run through the entire system. And when you look at the tension component itself, just kind of think of a person who has good posture standing versus someone who has poor posture while seated, and one can start to see the imbalances in tension between one side of the body, anterior, to the other side, posterior, and also the compressive forces at play with gravity pulling the person down and forward as they're sitting there staring at their computer screen all day. So with fascia itself, you have 12 main fascia lines within the body, and there's a very, very well-known book by a gentleman by the name of Thomas Myers. If you've not sourced this book or taken a look at it yet, I would highly advise doing so because it might give you a different perspective on how the body works and how you can work with the body. So let's take a look here. With the 12 fascia lines themselves, superficial front and back line, two lateral lines, a spiral line, you have arm lines, functional lines, two front and back, and then deep front line. Now, I'm not going to go into this in depth, but just for kind of comparison, just to kind of show what we're talking about here. So if you look at these two diagrams to the right, and you look at these two diagrams of fascia lines, when you look at the muscle itself, you have, like for example, the one on the left, the series of muscles starts at splenius capitis, goes through erector spinae, all the way down through the hamstrings and down into the plantar fascia of the back side of the body. When you look at the one to the right, this is more of a serrape effect. Serrape, very well-known term that was first coined by a gentleman by the name of Juan Carlos Santana, not the musical artist, but the physiologist, where it's a piece of Hispanic clothing that wraps around the person in a serrape type of effect. So when you look at these two side by side, you can start to put together that a functional movement pattern looks different depending upon which functional line we're calling to action. One can be more rotational, one can be more linear. And oftentimes we show this just as muscles, but many times you have to look at this and go, okay, it's the connective tissue that connects, but it's also the connective tissue that runs through the muscle and goes from tendinous insertion, if you will, through the muscle, more of a ligamentous type of connective process, back down to a tendinous process, to a ligament type process, to a tendinous process, all the way down into the full terminal extension, or I'm sorry, the beginning or end of the actual fascia itself. And I just want you to take a moment to kind of wrap yourself around like the different examples we talk about of people being seated or standing all day, and individuals where they have these stressors that are placed on their bodies and how it's now redistributed and offloaded through this entire system that's within the body itself. When you look at this model itself, the model itself, it's referred to as Tensegrity. And with that, it's really a combination of two words of tension and integrity. And the green to the right would represent the bones. The red would represent everything else, the muscles, tendons, and ligaments. And you can look at this and you can find a number of different models of these. When you look at it, as it articulates, when you apply force into one area, it gets redistributed into the other areas. And it's really a case of redistributing and offloading the stress to different areas. And as a trainer or coach, when you start to work with your clients and athletes, now I'm not saying somebody who has a shoulder issue, you should start working on their hip, but where I'm going with this is many times your person will come in and they'll have some kind of injury somewhere in a particular fascial line. somewhere in that series of muscle and tendon and ligament connective tissue. And somewhere in there, there's some kind of dysfunction. Perhaps it was an acute issue that happened, I don't know, 10 years ago. So they may have had a car accident and they had an acute injury, but that acute injury has manifested itself into a chronic condition. So you look at this and you start looking at ways to evaluate dysfunction in the human form, and we start to talk about this more later on in our chapter 12. We start talking about how to evaluate people, and it's not just plumb lines, but it's also just evaluating their fluidity of movement and evaluating if there's inhibited movement somewhere in that process. So again, we go back to these two side by side. Take a look again. You already know these two, and you know the one is a functional back line, the other one's a superficial back line, and you can look at the different muscles involved, and you should know some of these from anatomy classes, but you look at like the different movement patterns that are associated with these muscles, and it becomes what is a functional contractile path. So with a movement pattern itself, what muscles are being called to play to make a golf swing happen? What muscles are being called to play to make a broad jump happen? And you start to look at these very dynamic movement patterns and start to evaluate them just a little bit differently in terms of not just like an absoluteness in terms of its quads or glutes. It becomes an entire movement pattern that has a functional contractile path to make that movement happen. So again, I'm going to go back to Anatomy Trains. I would say take a look. Here's a link. You can link right out to it. Great book. You'll get lost down that rabbit hole pretty darn quick. And when you look at these videos, one of them is Thomas Myers. The other one is a guy who is kind of a trippy hippie dude. But the thing I want to point out is this. And I'm going to go ahead and pause this while I open this video. Okay, so I loaded this first video up, and watch what happens when he picks this up. How it changes. The form of it changes a little bit, and as he's moving it around, you end up having this tension that's being applied in the system, and it causes it to move. Matter of fact, when he puts this back down here in a few moments, you'll see the same thing, but he'll start to push on this point. You can see how it collapsed a little bit. So that ends up being a case where you can see how gravity, right, and causes the form to change. And you can kind of see how when you push and pull and try to articulate this movement or articulate this model around, the movement and the stress, put your fingers in quotes, that he's providing gets offloaded to different areas within the model itself. So his example and what he is in, if we look at these two side by side, we're basically a bag of bones that are connected by muscles, tendons, and ligaments. And as we apply stress into the system, it gets offloaded into the different areas of the body. So I always view this as a good side by side, and I like this. You know, he's got his dog chilling in the corner, and he's in his probably spare bedroom, but he does a pretty good job of describing how you offload the work from one area to another when you're in this model. Let me pause this gentleman here. I'll pause us. Yeah, and the other video that you have there will take you right out to Thomas Myers, and that's a good one too. You'll get, like I said, lost down a little bit of a rabbit hole in that one. So to that end, guys, I'm going to go ahead and break away on this. This is the end of video 2.